Hello. Today I'm going to make a pair of full front trousers. However, normally I completely machine sew these, but today I'm going to hand sew them. So I was just going to show you all the bits to begin with that you need to make them, and then go through the process of how I would hand sew them. This is not the definitive way of hand sewing them, but it's just how I would make and hand sew them. So I've got my fronts, which have got a piece that sticks up here, and that's because I'm going to have tabs that sit here, and then we'll have a buttonhole in here. Sometimes they have pockets, and sometimes the flap goes all the way over to the side seam, but this one doesn't. This one has just got two tabs on either side of the centre front, which is centre front shape there. And then, so that's my fronts. And then for behind that flap, you'll see as I go through the process that I'm going to cut through and everything, there are two flaps that I've cut in the top cloth and a lining. And then I've just started the process, so I've just pressed over the corner and pressed these seams in, because I'm going to lay that on top of there like that, so that it just sits inside, because this is the lining, I don't want it to be seen. So it's going to sit just inside, like that. In the other one in a moment. And those two are going to be the flaps that sit underneath the flap that flaps down. Okay, and they'll just it's putting something behind to protect your modesty, and maybe put a buttonhole in there as well, just to hold it all together. So that's those pieces. And then there's one more piece for the front, which I always forget to cut when I first start out. But this piece will sit in between these two, and it'll sit in there. Okay, you'll see as I go through the process why it's necessary to have that piece. Okay, so I'll come back to the fronts in a moment, but that's those. And then I've got my two backs, or a pair of backs, and this is going to be gathered into the waistband. Okay, so that's the top waistline of the trouser, the back trouser. So there's the backs, which I'm going to just put to one side for the moment, because I'm not going to get onto those for a little while. And then the last pieces are the waistband. So again, I just pressed over the top edge of the waistband, and I've just done the same on the lining. So I've got a pair, and eventually, I'm not going to do this at the moment, but eventually I will pin those onto there, just like I've done on that tab just now, and then I'm going to hand sew along there. Okay, and then it'll be machined to the front, or to the trouser, and then hand finished. Okay, all the long seams, all the seams that you can't see whether they're hand sewn, I machine sewn, partly for speed, but also for strength as well. This is a canvas linen, and actually what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to machine all the long seams, so the centre front, centre back, side seams and inside leg. I'm going to machine them twice, so that it gives it a bit more strength, because I'm a bit worried about this actually fraying out too much. It hasn't frayed as much as I thought it would, but I just don't want to chance it. So that's all my pieces. I'm going to sit down and machine the centre front line, machine the tabs on, and then go through the hand sewing process. Okay, so join me at the machine in a moment. Okay, so I'm going to put all the little bits to one side, and I've got my fronts. So that's my centre front line there. So I'm going to just machine those together. If you're doing this, then pin it if you want to. I'm just going to machine it. I'm using about half-inch. Well, I am using half-an-inch seam allowance, but it's entirely up to you whether you want to hand sew it. Not hand. Well, yeah, you can hand sew it if you want to. I don't trust my hand sewing to be strong enough for long seams, and also it's time consuming. But also because of the type of fabric, I just want to machine them twice. But what I meant to say was, if you want to pin it together to begin with, then please do so. Okay, and then the next step would be to press that open. I'll go and do that in a moment, because what I can do before I do that is actually sew on my tabs. So for this I am actually going to pin it in place, because I need to measure across and make sure that I've got it equal distance from the centre front. I'm not sure that you can see it, but there's a little notch there, and that tells me where I'm going to machine to. Okay, and then the rest of the tab is actually going to be turned. So I'm going to lay that there for the moment. And I'm going to do the same on that side. And then I'm going to take my tape measure, and I'm just going to measure. So that's 3 inches. That's 3 1/4. So I just want to move that over ever so slightly. Quarter. 3 1/4. So this one needs to be the same. So this needs to be 3 1/4 as well. 3 1/4. And oh, just shy of 3 1/4. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to machine down here and down here just to the notch, just so it attaches the tab to the front of the trouser. And I'm going to stop at that notch and reverse, obviously reverse at each end. I'm using about a 1/4 inch, I would think, just over 1/4 inch. Just need to make sure it's the same on both sides. There we go. Okay. And then that will be pressed up and around. And then before I go and press this, I'm going to, actually no, I'm not going to go, and I'm going to put the iron on. Okay, before I press this, I'm going to make these pieces up, and then I can sew them on at the same time, because they need to be sewn on here, and it's better to do that before you cut through. So I'm going to put those to one side for a minute, and then I'm just going to press. I'm going to sew here, and I'm just going to drop it down so I start about 1 centimetre below the top edge, and I'm going to find my thimble, and I'm just going to bring you a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm not going to slip stitch would be on the edge. I'm going to do I don't know what stitch you call it. I guess it's it's like a running stitch, and it basically, I'm going through all the layers, but the bottom layer, which will be the top side, I'm only just catching because I don't want it to be seen. It can be, you know, if it does show, it doesn't matter, especially seeing as I'm using white thread on white fabric. However, preferably you don't want it to be seen. So I'm just doing smaller stitches, and I'm pushing through using the thimble. Not naturally a hand sewer, so this has been a real challenge for me, and a learning curve of how to hand sew, really. And I've discovered that I don't enjoy having a hole in my finger that is caused by the end of a needle, so I've had to revert to using a thimble. So while I'm on this corner, I'm just going to catch those bits together there, and then go around the corner. I'm using single thread. When I first started doing these, I used double thread, but I think single thread is easier to use. It's easier to handle, and it's strong enough. It all depends as well what you're sewing through. This cotton that I've used as a backing is quite dense. It's very closely woven, so it's quite hard to get a needle through sometimes. I'm using a really fine needle. So that it can go through the cloth more easily. Okay, so I'm going to stop, do one more stitch, and then I'm going to stop because I don't want to get too close to the edge because I'm going to machine this on. So I'm going to just stop there. Why not? Hide my tail. Okay, and then I'm going to do, I've got a pair of those, so I'm going to do the other side in a moment. But before I do, I'm going to pin this in place and then stitch it just so you can see where I'm sewing it, and then I'll go and iron it, and then we'll carry on. So I'm pinning it so that the top fabric is right sides together with the front of the breech, with the trousers, and I'm butting the edge of this piece up to the edge of the tab. Okay, and I'm going to machine down, and I'm going to stop where the notch was on the tab. Okay, or notch is where the tab is. Okay, so I'm going to just do that, and I'm going to use the same width of seam allowance that I used on the other side on the tab, which was just over 1/4 inch. Usually when I do this, if I'm using a wool, I would just use 1/4 inch or the width of the foot. Because this phrase, I'm making the seam allowance a little bit bigger so that it is a bit more manageable, so that, because as soon as you start moving it, bits come off, and because I need to press all that open ultimately, I don't want it to just disappear. So join me back in a moment when I've stitched the other one, sewn it on and pressed it. Okay, so I've pressed it, and I've actually cut through as well. So when you saw it last, these were flapped out like that, and these were around like that. So I've literally just cut through just on the top cloth, so on the trouser, nothing else. Cut through in between those pieces, and then just done a little V at the end into where the stitching is, so that it releases it. And then I've pressed them, and I'll start with the inside flat bits. So what I would have ideally done was actually press that seam open, but unfortunately I cut my lining a little bit too short, so I've pushed it all into one side, and then all I've done is pin it, tucked in all the raw edges, and then I'm going to slip stitch down there, which I'll show you in a moment. The other side I just need to pin, so I'll just show you what I mean by all of that. So what I would have, ideally what I would have done was press that open, and then my lining would have come over further, and that would have just given it a flatter finish on this side. However, I'm pushing it all into one side, so that it's all hidden, all the raw edges are hidden inside the lining piece here. And then at the bottom, I'm just going to tuck that end up, When I come to slip stitch, I can just make sure that I catch all the raw edges in, which is partly why I want to slip stitch it rather than do this running stitch, because then it'll catch all those bits in. And then the outside bits, the tabs, all I've done is I've pressed it open, that's the centre front. I've pressed it open here, and I've left it so that it's flat on the inside. I've pressed over the top because we're going to hand sew across there, and then I've pressed this around so that that little V that I snipped, I'm going to tuck up in between, and then I've pressed this so that when we get to it, I can then stab stitch through there and do a rectangle to hold it all in place. Okay, these are sometimes pointed, but this is such an awkward fabric to use. I think I'd rather just use a square end. But yeah, so that's it. So the next step, I'm going to slip stitch those 2 pieces here, and then the next step for the tabs is to actually slip stitch that extra piece of cotton on. So what I would do with that, so that's going to sit there. So I'm just going to put some pins in to hold it. And what I'm actually going to do is machine through to begin with. Again, it's all about strength, and in an ideal world, my hand sewing will be strong enough to hold it. In the real world, I don't think it is. So I'd rather know that I've done this so that it's nice and tight, or nice and strong, so that if there's any pull, and there is likely to be, because if they're a bit small for the person, he will pull across there and he could undo all the stitching. So I'm going to stitch in the ditch down here and down here on the tabs, just to hold that back and just hold it nice and strong. Again, it's partly because of the fabric. Just don't completely trust it. It's okay at the moment, but I think long term it could end up causing a lot of trouble. So I'm just going to flip that top over for a minute. No, I'm not, sorry. I'm going to do that. Just making sure that I get right into that ditch. Reverse at each end. So if you really think about it, you could probably see that, but I think I can get away with it because it just needs that strength there. So just do down this side as well. There we are. Get rid of that. Okay. And then I'm going to get that, lots of fluff. I'm going to get my extra piece here. I've pressed the top and the bottom over, so I haven't got a raw edge, and I'm just going to match up centre front to centre front. Hold it in place, and then do the same down the bottom. Just need to check that it's long enough. Yeah, that'll be fine. So match up the centre line down the bottom, and then I can tuck these edges over, or under, sorry. And that will cover that machine line that I've just done. If you're being historically accurate, what you could do is just slip stitch that down there, and that would probably have held it as well. But like I say, I just don't trust my hand sewing being strong enough to hold it. So tuck that under like that. Right, and then the next step is to slip stitch, and I haven't decided what I'm going to do at these sides yet. Probably slip stitch, slip stitch and then stab across the top, and then all I'm going to do on the bottom is I'm going to do a running stitch which just holds the cotton, and then connect it at the centre front, and then running stitch to hold the cotton, because if there is if this is ever so slightly tight, it will pull across the front, so I'd rather it was left free to a certain extent, so that it can move. Okay, so I'm going to just hand sew these bits. Oops. Put my thimble on, and I'm just catching all of that under there, so all those raw edges are all caught in. So I've slip stitched down this side, getting all the raw edges inside, and I've done the same on that side, made sure I caught in the raw edges down the bottom, and then on the flap at the front I've slip stitched the cotton down on each side, and then I've stab stitched across, and when I stab stitched I went all the way across and did the top of the tabs as well. And then on the bottom edge of that piece of cotton, excuse me, on the bottom edge of this piece of cotton I've just done a running stitch, which I've then caught to the seam allowance at the centre front but left free otherwise. Okay, and that's the inside of the front of the flaps part of the trousers done. And then on the outside you can see the tabs are finished. I slip stitched round where there was raw edges, where it was all tucked inside, slip stitched around those two edges, and then I've stab stitched a box on both sides. Okay, and I've gone through and caught the bottom of the flap as well, just to make sure that it's nice and secure, because that's where it's going to end up pulling most. Okay, and then I'm just going to put a couple of pins in just to hold it. And then the next step is to sew the back panel on. Okay, so I've done it already on this side, and I'm just going to show you how to do it on the other side. So when you sew your trousers together, you should always sew it so that on the outside leg and the inside leg, you should always sew it so that your front trouser panel is on top. Now I know that I've got a seam allowance of 1 inch on my back panel and 1/2 inch on my front panel, so I'm just going to offset them by 1/2 inch. Obviously, if you're new to this, make sure you mark it, make sure you measure it, and make sure that you've got right sides together. And the other thing that we're going to look out for, and we're going to find, is any notches that we've done. So where the knee line was, there was a notch, so that's my front, and then I'm going to match it up to my back one, but obviously still keep that 1/2 inch difference. Oh, that doesn't look like it's the right notch. No, that's not the right notch. There we go. Okay, and that means that from that point, from the hem to the knee, they should match. And then the reason you've got your front on top, partly because the seam allowance is different, but also because you might need to, because the shapes may differ, you need to ease your back panel into your front, and naturally your machine will do that to a certain extent because the teeth will pull that underneath fabric. So if you've ever got anything that's just ever so slightly bigger than your top fabric, try putting it underneath, and then it will pull it. Not greatly, but it'll just ease it ever so slightly, which will just mean that it will match up more easily. Okay, so I'm now going to machine down. I'm going to start at the hem and machine to the top, use 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to do it all over again, partly, well, mainly because I don't trust my fabric from fraying. Oops. Reverse at each end, and make sure that you're on a normal stitch length. If you're using a standard wool or a satin or a silk or something, and you don't necessarily need, if you know it's not going to fray, you can just do this seam once. You don't need to do it twice. It's only because I want to make sure that it's as strong as possible. And obviously, if you want to hand sew it, then hand sew it as well. Or if you want to overlock the edges or turn back the edges, hindsight, which is, as we know, the most wonderful thing in the world, I would have actually left a bigger seam allowance and then turned the edge of my fabric. But it didn't occur to me when I cut them out that this would cause me an issue. So I'm just machining straight over the stitching that I've just done, just to make sure it's nice and strong. There we go. And then the next step for the side seam would be to press it open. But before I do that, I'm just going to gather the back waistline. So this pair of trousers, that back panel is gathered into the waistband. So I'm going to just allow 2 inches at centre back, because I know that I've got that as excess for alterations. And then I'm going to turn my stitch length up as high as it will go. I have done a separate video on how to gather, but I'll just do it. It's a bit more instructional, the other one, but I'm just going to talk it through as I do it here. So make sure you've got a nice long tail on your top thread and your bobbin thread. Keep your seam allowance out of the way. And what I'm going to end up doing, I'm doing a machine stitch, largest stitch length I can do, no reversing start and end, and I'm doing it 1/4 of an inch from the edge of my fabric, and I'm going to stop at that 2-inch point at centre back. And then I'm going to do another row. Now I think my seam allowance is 1/2 inch, so my machine line, when I sew it to the waistband, is going to be 1/2 inch from my raw edge. So I want the other gathering stitch to be over again from where my seam line is going to be. So I'm going to machine another row of gathering, which is 3/4 of an inch from the edge. I'm eyeballing this, but please, if you want to mark it, mark it. The easiest thing to do actually is to mark your, and I'll show you in the other video, is to mark your machine line, your seam line, and then put your foot of your machine up to either side and do a gather stitch on either side, a foot's width away from your finished seam line. That's the easiest way to do it. And then I'm just, to secure my threads, just so to make sure I don't pull them through, which I don't think is likely on this fabric, but you never know. I'm just knotting them. So I'm knotting top thread to top thread and bottom thread to bottom thread. And then when I gather, I'm going to pull the bottom thread. So it was my bobbin thread. So when I machined those gathering stitches, I made sure that my right side was on the top, so that the underneath threads are the ones that I'm actually going to pull and gather. Okay, so I'm going to press my seams open. I'm going to pull and gather this so that it ends up being the right length for my waistband. And then when you come back, I'll show you how I attach the waistband. Okay, so I've pressed my side seams open on my trousers, and I've pulled the gathering in preparation for the waistband. I've also prepped the waistband, so I've left it open at each end, but I've just stab stitched across the top edge with the lining on both pieces. The length here, my customer's waistline is 38 inches, so it needs to be, so each piece needs to be half that, which is 19 inches, and then there's an overlap. Now you can do the overlap so that on the side that the buttonhole sits, it's meets centre front. I'm always a bit wary if I don't know the client about doing that, so I always leave it so that it overlaps on both sides. And I've got an overlap here, so I can work it out. I've pinned my fronts in place where they're going to end up sitting. My centre front is here, and then I can see that I've got an overlap of approximately 2 inches. It's just under. So I've left, basically I've added that 2 inches onto my waistline, because from centre front, I move that one out of the way. So I've got, so the length of my waistband on this side needs to be from the edge there, centre front is there, so it needs to be my half waist, which is 19, plus that 2 inches, so that's 21. So from the edge there, go along until I reach 21. And do you remember me saying earlier that I've got about 2 inch seam out, 2 inch extra there, just so that I've got, just in case I need to amend the sizing. Okay, so that's, and it's over a little bit, but I'm going to gather it a little bit more when I attach the waistband. So that length is the same as it is here. So that should be, if I've measured this right, should be 21. Okay, so the only other thing I've done that I haven't mentioned is with the lining. I've left it open at the back so that I can machine that all the way to the end. I should have 2 inches there approximately, which will marry up with the back. And then also I've just set the lining here ever so slightly back, because I'm going to put eyelets in here, or hand sew eyelets here, and I don't want to be sewing it through the cotton as well. Okay, so the next step is to flip the lining out of the way and take the trouser, and you can unpin it for the moment. And I'm going to take right side of the trouser to the right side of the waistband, match up the front edge, and at the side seam I'm just going to put a vertical pin in that holds my front seam allowance forward, and a vertical pin in that holds my back seam allowance back. Okay, and then I'm going to match up back edge of the trouser, and I'm going to put some vertical pins in here. And what I'm actually going to do in a moment, I'm going to actually flip it over and pin it from the other side again, because when I machine it, I want to machine it from this side. Okay, so when you do gathering, you should always machine so that you've got the gathering on top if possible. It's not always possible, but if possible, because then you can see whether your gathering is actually doing what it's supposed to do. Yeah, I think my gathering can be pulled in a little bit more, so I'm going to put it in. This is a very odd fabric. I've not used it before, and it's an open weave. It's a linen and canvas mix. It's linen and cotton, but it makes it just feel so heavy and dense. I wouldn't say it's something that I've enjoyed using. Okay. Okay. It's quite malleable though, I suppose, in a way, so it's not disastrous, but yeah, it's not my favourite thing that I've ever used. Okay. So we're going to machine along there. If you want to, you can flip that back just to reduce the bulk, and I'm going to open that up as well so that it reduces the bulk, and then when I'm hand sew it, it'll sit in a slightly different place then. So I'm going to do exactly the same to the other side, and then I'm going to machine along there, and then I'll come back and show you what I'm going to do next. Right, so I've sewn the waistband onto the trouser, and then I've taken out the gathering stitch, and I didn't have a lot to gather, so it's not very even, it's not very much there, but it's still there. So that's both sides, and then I've on the inside I've finished off the stitching around the top edge and the front, and then I've slip stitched along the bottom so everything's enclosed. When I pressed it, I pressed it so that the seam allowance was open on the waistband, just so it creates a flat edge basically. And then the last step that I've just done is I've sewn up the centre back. Okay, so I left the lining free towards the back end, and then I've sewn up and started at half an inch, and then gone back to where the crease line is, which is my 2-inch seam allowance. Okay, so the next step would be to press that, and then we can finish attaching the lining. And I find it easier. Some people sew the 2 legs together first, but I find sewing the hand particularly hand sewn, but sewing the lining in on the waistband and putting the waistband on is much easier to do if you haven't got your centre back joined up. So on both sides, I will, in a moment, finish slip stitching the hem of the waistband lining, and then slip stitch the centre back of it as well. So slip stitch up there. But before I do that, I'm just going to pin the inside legs together. So same as I did on the outside leg, I'm going to turn it over so that I've got my front on top. Make sure that those seam allowances, so that's my front fork and back fork, match them up, make sure the seam allowances are pressed open. And this time, because I've got equal seam allowance on my front and back leg, I'm going to match the edges, but I'm going to do what I did earlier, which is I'm also going to match the notch on my knee line. Okay, so see, that's on my front leg, that's on my back, and I'm just going to line those up with each other and put a pin in. But working on, and you'll see, hopefully, that there is just a slight discrepancy in size there, which is why you need to ease them in. Also decided to stab myself quite a lot in this bit of the video, so hopefully I won't end up bleeding on anything. So match up my hem, and then do the same on the other leg. So match my knee notches at my knee, match the hem, pin in the middle, and then you can see it here. It's just a little discrepancy in size, which is fine. You will get that. It's not a wrong thing. It's just that if you make sure that your back panel is on the underside, then you'll be able to ease that in more easily. And what I'm going to do, because I want the strength to be, so that's the fork of the trouser, what I want to do is make sure it's nice and strong there. Now normally I would start here, and I'd machine all the way to the hem on that side, and then I would start and reverse, and then I would stop and then start again here and go that way, so that I'd end up with a double row stitching across the middle here. So I'd start that one and go all the way down to the hem at that end. But because of the fabric, the way it is, I'm actually going to, I think I will just do that section first. So I might just do that and then do that, and then I'll go, yes, I'm going to do, so I'm going to start here, go all the way to that hem, start there, go all the way to that hem, and then I'm going to start at that hem and go all the way along, and then that will mean that I've got 2 rows of stitching everywhere, and then in this part I'll have extra strength as well, because I'll have gone over it extra time. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do next, and then I'm going to hand sew that, and then hand sew some eyelets, put some buttonholes in the front, and then it's ready to go. Okay, so I sewed up my inside leg, pressed it open, and I did what I said I'd do. I'd machined it from there to the hem, then there to the hem, and then all the way along, just to give it extra strength. And then I've turned up the hem on the trouser and herringboned it. So I've double turned it just again because of the fabric, but also just to make it look neater. So I double turned it, and then I've herringboned that. Finished off the waistband lining at the back, eyelets, just handed some eyelets, laced it up, added some brace buttons, and then the last bit of what I need to do is the buttonholes, which I've done on the machine. I'm just going to open them up. And then normally I'd put on buttons, but the client has got his own buttons, so he'll be doing that at his end. So just open. So there's a buttonhole on the top of each tab on the front flap, and then I've put 2 on the waistband and 1 on the inside flap. I'll show you in a second. Let's get this one open. This is why you don't want too much bulk inside, because you don't want to have too many layers inside your buttonhole, otherwise they're very difficult to undo and then they'll be very difficult to use. So look at the front like that, and we have 2 buttons on the waistband, 1 here and then 1 on either side of the flap. And then I'm just going to mark a tiny little dot in red where the buttonholes sit, or the buttons will sit, and that's it, them done. This is not the only way to make full front trousers, and I'm not saying it's the right way. It is one way, and it's one of the ways that I do. It's not the only way that I make them, it's just one of the ways that I make them. So if you've learned anything, if it's been of use, please click the like button. Hopefully it's been of interest, and even if you don't follow it exactly, at least it might give you a bit of guidance of how to do it in the future. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good day. Bye.